The helicopter didn't land. It crashed, a fireball punching through the night sky, scattering burning wreckage across the rooftop of Harlow Peak Medical Center, while nurses below screamed and sprinklers rained down in sheets. Inside the trauma bay, Dr. Marcus Red was already shouting orders at the float nurse mopping the corner floor. "Get out of my ER, Carter. You don't belong here." And Wren Carter, quiet, forgettable, the woman's staff called dead weight, set down her mop and looked at the door. Because whoever had just fallen out of that helicopter, they'd come here for her. Before this story pulls you under, and it will, hit that subscribe button and follow this channel so you don't miss a single drop of what's coming next. Stories like this one don't wait around. While you're at it, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go. The float schedule had Wren Carter assigned to the 3rd floor on the night of October 14th, which meant linen carts and vital checks and staying invisible, which was exactly how she preferred it. Harlow Peak Medical Center sat at the edge of Delwick, Montana, a mid-sized regional hospital that served a wide corridor of mountain towns and ranch communities, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and gossip moved faster than lab results. Wren had been there 11 months, long enough to learn which attending physicians through charts and which ones just through attitude, long enough to map every supply closet and service elevator, not long enough to matter to anyone. That was intentional. She was 41, lean in the way people get when they've spent years moving fast and eating whatever was in reach. With close-cropped dark hair she never bothered styling, and hands that stayed steady when everything around them didn't. She wore her scrubs plain, no name badge lanyards with cartoon prints, no motivational pins, nothing that invited conversation. The other nurses on the float pool called her quiet. The charge nurses called her reliable. Dr. Marcus Red, chief of emergency medicine, called her a liability. "I need people in that bay who can think," he'd said in front of 6 staff members 3 weeks into her time at Harlow Peak, loud enough that the unit clerk had looked up from her screen. "Not people who are here to push mops and not get in the way." Wren had said, "Yes, doctor," and moved the linen cart out of the corridor. She did not explain herself. She did not tell him what her hands had done in places he'd never been. She pulled the cart to the service hallway and kept moving, and she let him have what he thought he knew about her because correcting people like Marcus Red cost more than it returned. That was the calculus she'd made when she came to Delwick. Small footprint, clean record, no drama. She'd chosen a community far from major bases, far from anyone who might recognize her face, taken a job at a hospital rural enough that military helicopters weren't a common sight. She wanted ordinary. She'd spent 17 years earning the right to it. October 14th had started like every other shift. She clocked in at 1900 hours, pulled her assignment sheet, noted that she had 4 rooms on the telemetry floor, and a flex assignment to cover breaks in the ER. She grabbed coffee from the break room, black, no sugar, drank it standing at the window watching the last strip of orange die behind the western peaks. The mountains here were something. She'd give Delwick that. By 2100, she was running a 12 lead on a 63-year-old rancher with chest pressure and a story about ignoring symptoms for 2 days, because that was what men in this part of Montana did. They ignored things until the body stopped letting them. She talked him through it in a low, matter-of-fact voice, not soothing exactly, just direct. People in pain didn't need soft. They needed someone who wasn't scared. "Am I having a heart attack?" the rancher asked. "Your EKG looks like you're having a very bad night," she said. "The cardiologist is going to come look at this and tell us what's next. What I need from you is to keep still and stop clenching your jaw." He laughed a little, surprised by it. "You're not like the regular ones. I'm afloat. We're different." She had the leads placed and the strip running and the IV access in his right AC before the on-call cardiologist even answered the page. When Dr. Red appeared in the doorway, he wasn't supposed to be on this floor. His domain was the ER downstairs, but Red moved through the hospital like he owned the deed to it. She didn't look up. "Carter." His voice had that particular texture she'd learned to read. Not urgent, just contemptuous. "Who told you to run a 12 lead without an order?" Standing protocol for chest pain with diaphoresis. She peeled off her gloves. I've paged cardiology. I didn't ask what you paged, I asked who authorized you. He stepped into the room, which was unnecessary, which was the whole point. You're a float nurse. You follow orders. You don't make clinical decisions and you don't overstep. And frankly, I don't know why staffing keeps putting you in rotations where you can cause damage. The rancher was watching. His blood pressure was already elevated. Wren noted that and filed it. Mr. Garfield, she said to the patient, I'm going to step outside for a moment. I'll be right back. She moved to the doorway, which forced Red to either follow her into the corridor or make a scene in front of a sick man, and to his credit, he followed. In the hallway, she kept her voice at a level that wouldn't carry. His rate is irregular with lateral changes. I followed standing protocol. If you want to discuss the order set, I'm available after cardiology clears him. Red's jaw tightened. He was 54 and had the look of a man who'd been handsome in a conventional way once, and now wore authority where the looks used to be. You think you're something, Carter. I've dealt with nurses like you, full of initiative until you blow something up, then you disappear and leave someone else to mop up. He leaned slightly closer. Stay in your lane. Stay out of my ER. And if I find you making calls above your level again, I'll have you pulled from the float pool permanently. We clear? Yes, doctor, she said. He walked away. She went back in and checked Mr. Garfield's pressure and found it had climbed 8 points. He's always like that? The rancher asked. I've seen worse, Wren said honestly, and she meant it, and she adjusted the head of the bed and watched the strip and waited for cardiology. The cardiologist confirmed NSTEMI 40 minutes later. The rancher went to the cath lab before midnight. Wren documented her assessment, flagged the protocol she'd used, and moved to her next assignment. Nobody said anything to her for the rest of the shift. Nobody thanked her. She didn't require it. She was changing the battery on a pulse ox unit in the supply room at 2314 when the explosion hit. It didn't sound like an explosion at first. It sounded like a pressure drop. That strange compression in the ears that precedes a large concussive event. And then the building shook, a single deep shudder that rattled the shelving units and sent a box of saline flushes off the top shelf. The lights flickered. A car alarm started screaming in the parking structure outside. Someone in the hallway yelled something that got swallowed by the building's own emergency alert system kicking on. Wren was already moving before the alert finished its first tone. She hit the stairwell door and took the stairs down, not the elevator. Elevators in emergencies were where people got trapped. And she could smell it before she reached the roof access level. Aviation fuel and burning composite material, hot and acrid, the specific chemical signature of a rotary aircraft going down hard. Her body knew that smell. Her body had a physical memory of it that bypassed thought entirely, and her pace shifted without a decision being made, a gear change that happened somewhere below conscious intention. The roof was chaos. A military helicopter, a Black Hawk variant, she clocked that immediately, the profile recognizable in firelight even through smoke, had come down hard on the north landing pad, skidding 30 feet off center, the tail rotor sheared clean, one side of the fuselage crumpled where it had caught the rooftop equipment housing. The main rotors had thankfully stopped, but fuel was pooling and a section of the undercarriage was burning steadily. 3 hospital security guards were at the stairwell door looking paralyzed. A facilities worker was already on the phone. 2 other nurses had come up behind Wren and were standing at the access door, unsure whether to advance. Through the smoke and the flicker, she could see movement at the helicopter's side door. Someone was dragging a body out. The person doing the dragging was himself bleeding, arm, she noted, left deltoid, likely through and through, moving with the mechanical focus of someone trained to keep going past the point their body wanted to quit. He got the casualty to the rooftop surface and dropped to his knees and pressed both hands to the other man's inner thigh, where blood was sheeting out in a volume that told her everything she needed to know. Femoral, active, arterial, she was running. Call a trauma alert, she said, loud and clear, to nobody and everyone behind her. Rooftop, north pad, 2 casualties, penetrating trauma, 1 critical hemorrhage. Move. The nurse behind her, Becca, 3rd-year ER nurse, good instincts, got on her radio. Wren crossed the roof at a pace that wasn't quite running, because running on a rooftop with pooling fuel and debris was how you became a third casualty. But it was close. The man applying pressure looked up when she reached them. His face was cut across the cheek, both eyes red-rimmed from smoke, and he wore no identifying insignia she could immediately see. The uniform stripped of patches, which meant something. He looked at her the way a person looks when they've run out of options and are deciding whether the option in front of them counts. "Femoral laceration," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Tourniquet's on, but it's not seated right. I can feel it." She was already looking. He was right. The tourniquet had been applied in the field, probably fast, probably under fire, and it had saved the man's life getting him here, but it was 2 inches too distal, and the pressure wasn't fully occluding the vessel. Blood was still moving, not as fast, but moving. "I need to reseat this," she said. "He's going to spike pain when I do. Hold him." "He's been unconscious for 4 minutes. Then hold him anyway." She worked fast, loosening and repositioning, and the man on the ground, young, she registered, mid-20s, broad across the shoulders, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and his entire body went rigid, and the other operator held his shoulders down without being told twice. The tourniquet seated. She tightened it to occlusion, and the bleeding slowed to seepage. "Okay?" She checked his airway. Clear, and put 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse rapid and weak, but there. "He needs blood." "How long ago was he hit?" 31 minutes. She did the math without speaking. 31 minutes of arterial hemorrhage with a compromised tourniquet. His pressure was going to be in the basement. If his hemoglobin was already trending critical, she had maybe minutes before he went into hemorrhagic shock that no ER protocol in a facility this size could pull him back from. The door to the stairwell burst open, and she heard voices she recognized. Red among them, already barking, because Red was always among the first to arrive anywhere that might become a story people told later. "Get those patients inside, get them on gurneys, and someone get the fire department on the line. We need 2 units ONEG on the roof right now," Wren called without turning. "And a trauma cart. And someone bring me a chest seal kit." "Carter," Red's voice. "Step back." She didn't. "This tourniquet needs to stay at exactly this tension until he's on the table. If anyone touches this strap before then, he loses the leg or the blood pressure, probably both." She looked up then, directly at Red. "I need someone to maintain pressure here while I prep him for transport. Are you going to help, or are you going to stand there?" The rooftop had gotten quiet in the particular way that a space gets quiet when people are watching something and waiting to see how it falls. Red stared at her. His face had gone through 3 different expressions in the space of a few seconds: contempt, calculation, something that might have been uncertainty, and landed on a version of fury that was working to look like authority. "You are a float nurse on a linen assignment, and you do not dictate." "He's Bradying down," said the operator across from her, and she heard it too, the pulse under her fingers shifting. She made a decision and stopped waiting for the room to resolve itself. "Becca," she said, and Becca was there, because Becca had come across the roof while Red was talking. "Right here. Hold this tension, count with me." She guided Becca's hands to the tourniquet strap and talked her through it in 4 seconds, and then she was moving to the casualty's head and tilting his airway and checking his pupils. Right was sluggish, which meant the hypoperfusion was already hitting his brain. And she looked back at the other operator, who was still kneeling on the ground watching her with that expression she couldn't quite classify. "When did he last have any responsiveness?" "Maybe 6 minutes ago." "He said a name." The operator paused, and something crossed his face. "He said yours." She stopped. Not for long. A beat, maybe 2, the pause of someone recalibrating something internal. "What name?" she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Raven," the operator said. His eyes stayed on her face. He said, "Raven." The rooftop noise, the fire suppression crew arriving, Red on his radio, the gurney wheels on the rooftop surface. All of it continued, but she heard it from a different distance now, the way you hear a room when part of your attention has just been pulled somewhere else entirely. She looked down at the face of the man on the ground, really looked, past the blood and the smoke grime and the slack features of unconsciousness, and she felt something knock loose in her chest. She knew him. She didn't let it show. There was no room for it to show, and no use for it on a rooftop with a man bleeding out and a tourniquet that needed constant attention and a physician 20 feet away who was already on the phone with someone, almost certainly trying to build the administrative case to have her removed from this situation before she could do anything else without his permission. "Let's move him," she said. Her voice was level. She'd had practice keeping it level. "On my count." They got him to the gurney, and she walked beside it with her hand on the tourniquet the entire way down. And when the elevator doors opened into the ER hallway and the overhead fluorescence replaced the firelight and smoke, she could see him clearly for the first time, and she was certain. Staff Sergeant Danny Holt. She had carried him out of a burning vehicle in a country whose name she still wasn't cleared to say, in a year that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. He had been 22. She had spent 4 minutes with her hands inside his body, keeping him alive until the medevac arrived. He had called her Raven, because that was what her unit had called her, in the years before she had a unit, in the years before she had a name she used in places like this. "Bay 1, Red said, pushing past her. "I'll take it from here, Carter." She let him say it. She let him move to the head of the gurney, and she watched his hands, and she watched his eyes, and she watched him do exactly what she'd feared, which was look at the chart and see the tourniquet notes and start giving orders that reflected his civilian training, his textbook excellent, and his instincts built for a very different kind of trauma than the one line in front of him. She counted to 7. Then she said, "That resuscitation sequence is wrong." Red turned around. The bay was full. 2 nurses, a respiratory tech, the ER resident, the operator from the roof who had followed them down and was standing against the far wall, and the charge nurse hovering near the door. Everyone in the room had just heard her. "Excuse me," Red said. "He's in Class 3 hemorrhagic shock trending to Class 4. The fluid resuscitation you just ordered is going to dilute his clotting factors and accelerate the coagulopathy. In a penetrating trauma with this bleed volume, you push whole blood or a balanced ratio pack, not crystalloid." She kept her voice flat and clinical. "He needs damage control resuscitation, not standard ATLS volume replacement." The silence that followed had a specific quality to it. Not hostile exactly, but taut, the way air gets before something changes. Red set down the chart. "Get her out of my bay." Nobody moved. He looked at the nurses, at Becca, at the ER tech, at the resident who was watching Wren with an expression that had gone from confused to something more careful. "I said get her out." "Doctor," the operator's voice from the wall, low and even. "That woman is the only reason Danny Holt has a pulse right now. Whatever she's saying, you should probably listen to it." Red turned on him. "Sir, I don't know who you are or what unit you're with, but this is my emergency department." "His pressure's dropping," Wren said. And it was. The monitor showed it plainly. Systolic at 71 and falling, the waveform going flat and fast in the way that meant there was no more time for conversation, no more room for anyone in the bay to be concerned about who had authority or how things were supposed to work. She moved to the supply cart, and her hands found what they needed without having to search, because she had trained herself a long time ago to map every supply cart she ever worked near, every kit, every drawer, every fallback position. She pulled the massive transfusion protocol bag and a pressure infuser, and she turned back to the bed and she looked at Marcus Red, and she said, very quietly, "You can stop me, or you can help me. But you cannot do both." Red held his position for 3 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than anyone in the bay expected, and then he stepped back. It wasn't agreement, it wasn't deference. It was the calculation of a man who had just looked at a monitor reading 71 systolic and decided that the math of the situation had temporarily outweighed his pride. And Wren didn't mistake it for anything more than that, because men like Red didn't step back from things. They repositioned, regrouped, and came back harder when the immediate crisis gave them room to breathe again. She had known enough of them to recognize the move. She didn't wait for him to change his mind. "Pressure infuser on that line," she said to Becca, who was already moving. "I need the MTP activated. Call the blood bank. Tell them we need the full panel, 6 packed red cells, 6 FFP, 1 platelet, and I need the first cooler up here in under 4 minutes." She was at the bedside now, her hands moving over the patient with the efficiency of someone who had done this not in training scenarios, but in actual darkness, in actual noise, with actual consequences. Warm the lines, and someone get me the thoracic tray. Thoracic, the ER resident, a young man named Pollard, who had been at Harlow Peak 8 months and had never seen anything like what was happening in front of him, stopped himself mid-sentence. Tray, Wren said. Now. He went. Red moved to her left side, not to help, but to observe, which she understood was his way of building the record he'd use against her later. She could feel him cataloging every action, every word, every deviation from the civilian protocols he'd built his career around, and she accepted that as the cost of what she was doing and kept working. Danny Holt's color was terrible. The monitor showed his rate climbing as his pressure fell, the body's last-ditch effort to maintain perfusion by spinning the remaining blood faster and faster through a volume that was no longer adequate to fill the circuit. She had seen that compensation pattern fail. She had watched it fail in conditions far less equipped than this, and she was not going to watch it fail here under fluorescent lights with a blood bank 40 feet away. "Talk to me," she said, not to Red, not to Becca, but to the operator who had come down from the roof and was now standing just inside the bay door in a way that kept him in the room without being in the way, which told her something about his training. "His name is Daniel Holt," the operator said, staff sergeant. "He took 2 rounds through the right thigh approximately 38 minutes ago during a vehicle exfiltration. We applied a tourniquet at the scene, lost IV access during the transit. What was his pressure when you applied it?" A pause. "Palpable radial, barely. So he'd been hypotensive at the scene. 38 minutes ago." Wren ran that number through the calculation she carried in the back of her head from years of having to make decisions with incomplete information and a very short clock, and what came out the other side wasn't encouraging. His lactate was going to be high, his clotting was already compromised. The window she was working in was real, but it was not wide. The blood bank cooler arrived at 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Which was 12 seconds late, but still faster than she'd expected from a facility that didn't run MTPs on a regular basis. She had the first unit running through the pressure infuser before the cooler was fully set down, the warm blood moving into his line alongside the plasma, and she watched the monitor with the particular quality of attention that wasn't hope exactly. Hope was too passive, but something closer to active insistence. "You need to tell me what you're doing and why," Red said from her left. His voice had modulated to something he probably considered measured and professional. "For the record, damage control resuscitation," she said. "Permissive hypotension until hemorrhage is controlled, balanced blood product replacement to preserve coagulation, avoiding the crystalloid that would dilute his factors and push him into the lethal triad." She didn't look at him. "It's the standard of care for combat casualty with penetrating vascular trauma. It's been the standard of care for over a decade. This is not a combat hospital." "No," she said. "But he's a combat casualty. His physiology doesn't change because of the zip code." Red said nothing to that. She felt him shifting his weight behind her, the particular restless movement of a man looking for the angle. The resident, Pollard, came back with the thoracic tray and set it on the stand beside her without being asked to open it, which she appreciated. She checked the contents in 3 seconds. Everything she needed was there, which surprised her because smaller regional hospitals often ran incomplete trays, but Harlow Peak apparently stocked to a higher standard than its case volume suggested. "His pressure is coming up," Becca said. 78. 81.1. The rate was slowing slightly, the compensatory tachycardia beginning to ease as the volume came in. Not safe, not stable, but moving in the right direction. Wren let herself take one controlled breath. "We need to get him to the OR," she said. "That femoral laceration isn't going to hold with just a tourniquet. He needs vascular repair, and he needs it in the next 20 minutes, or the leg doesn't survive even if he does." "I'm aware of the surgical timeline," Red said. "Then call vascular. Tell them he's coming." "I will make that determination." "Dr. Red," the operator's voice from the doorway, still quiet, still even. But there was something underneath the evenness that had not been there before, a density to it, the way bedrock is dense compared to soil. "Call the surgeon." Red turned to look at him fully for the first time. He seemed to be reassessing something. "Who exactly are you?" Someone who's been patient for about as long as I'm going to be. The operator straightened from the wall. He was not a large man in any obvious way, medium height, unremarkable build, but the way he occupied space had changed slightly, and everyone in the bay noticed it. "Make the call, please." The word please landed with approximately the same energy as a door closing. Red picked up the phone. Wren kept her eyes on Danny Holt and kept her hands moving and let the rest of the room sort itself out around her, which was something she had also learned a long time ago. When you're the one keeping someone alive, everything outside your hands is peripheral, and the ability to treat it as peripheral is not indifference. It's discipline. It's what you owe the person on the table. By the time vascular surgery answered, Holt's pressure had climbed to 89/54, which was still critically low, but was a different animal than where he'd started. His color remained poor, but his rate had come down to 106. He was still unconscious. She didn't know yet what the extended hypoperfusion had done to his brain. She didn't let herself think about that yet. "OR is prepping," Red said, putting the phone down. His voice had gone flat in the way that meant he was managing something, containing it, planning where to redirect it. "Transport in 6 minutes. 4, Wren said. "The OR team needs 4 minutes," she said again. "His lactate is climbing. Every minute we hold in this bay past medically necessary is a minute of additional end organ damage." She finally looked at him. "You can document that we disagreed, that's fine, but we move him in 4. Red stared at her for a long moment. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws do when people are deciding between the thing they want to say and the thing that won't blow back on them later. 4 minutes, he said. She nodded and turned back to the patient. What happened in those 4 minutes was not dramatic in any visible sense. It was lines and readings and preparation and the kind of focused, ugly, unglamorous work that keeps people alive in the transition between crisis and definitive care. Resecuring the tourniquet for transport, packaging the blood products to travel with him, briefing the OR nurse on what she'd done and why and what they'd find when the vascular surgeon opened the leg. She talked fast and she talked precisely, and the OR nurse, a woman in her 50s named Geraldine, who had been at Harlow Peak longer than anyone else on the floor, listened with the expression of someone hearing information they hadn't expected from the source delivering it. "Where did you train?" Geraldine asked, not accusatory, just trying to place something that didn't fit the frame she had for Wren Carter. Float nurse, linen assignments. "A lot of different places," Wren said. "The vascular clamp is already pre-positioned on the left side of the tray. Tell Dr. Vasquez to look there first." Geraldine looked at her for another half-second, then nodded and followed the gurney out. The bay emptied in stages. The resident trailing the transport team, Becca going to chart, the blood bank tech retrieving the cooler. The operator stayed. Red stayed. The three of them were left in a trauma bay that looked like what it was. A room where someone had almost died and hadn't, mostly, not yet. And the overhead fluorescents hummed in the specific way fluorescents hum when a room is quiet enough to hear them. Red spoke first. "You're done," he said. Not loudly, almost conversationally, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "I'm going to the chief of staff tonight. What you just did, taking over a trauma resuscitation without authorization, ordering blood products without a physician cosign, making surgical timing decisions, that's not nursing practice overstep, Carter. That's grounds for license review." Wren was stripping off her gloves. She did it methodically, one finger at a time, and she dropped them in the biohazard bin, and she looked at Marcus Red and she said, "You're going to do what you're going to do. You think that's a threat I won't follow through on?" "I think you'll follow through on it," she said. "I think you'll have me pulled from the floor tonight, and I think you'll file the report, and I think you'll build the case the way you know how to build cases, because you've done it before." She held his gaze. She was tired, suddenly and completely, the way you get tired when you've been running on discipline and muscle memory, and the crash arrives all at once. "And I think Danny Holt will still be alive when you do it." Red's expression went through something complicated. Then he pulled out his phone and walked out of the bay. She stood in the empty trauma space for approximately 30 seconds, which was as long as she allowed herself. And then she went to find a chair and write her documentation before her memory of the sequence faded, because documentation was the one thing nobody could take away from you after the fact, and she had learned that lesson earlier in her life than she would have chosen. The operator found her at a charting station in the hallway 40 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him, the specific cadence of someone who moved deliberately, no wasted motion. And she didn't look up from the screen, but she tracked him in her peripheral vision until he stopped beside her and leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, the body language of someone who wasn't in a hurry and wasn't leaving. "You don't have to hover," she said. "I know." He didn't move. "Vasquez is in with him. Early report is the femoral repair is going to hold." She let herself absorb that. "Good. You want to tell me what's going on with the physician back there? Because from where I was standing, that looked like it had history in it." "It has about 11 months of history," she said. "Nothing dramatic." "Didn't look like nothing." She saved her documentation and pushed back slightly from the screen and looked at him properly for the first time without the urgency of the trauma bay setting the terms. He was maybe 35, with the kind of face that kept most of its expression in the eyes, and his left arm had been bandaged at some point in the last hour. She clocked that without meaning to, noted the dressing was adequate and the color of his fingers normal, filed it. "What's your name?" "Garrett Lowe," he said. "You were in the bird with him." "I was the one flying it when the hydraulics went." A pause. "We had a harder landing than planned." She looked at the bandage. "You should have that imaged." "I know." He didn't move to go get it imaged. "He knew you, Carter. He's been talking about you for years. After what happened He always said if he ever needed someone to be there, he wanted it to be Raven." He said the name without inflection, just placed it down between them like something he was handing over. "I know that's not who you are here." "No," she said. "It's not." "Why Delwick?" She looked back at the screen. Seemed quiet. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's it? Seemed quiet?" "I'm a float nurse in a regional hospital in Montana. I do linen assignments and vital signs, and I go home and I sleep without a radio in my ear." She closed the chart. "That was the plan. And now?" She didn't answer that, because the honest answer was that she didn't know yet, and she'd learned not to fill silences she wasn't ready to fill. She stood up from the chair. "Your arm needs imaging. There's a radiology tech in the department until 0300. Go get it looked at." "Carter." She was already moving. He spoke to her back. "Red filed the complaint. I heard him on the phone. He's calling it assault and practicing medicine without a license. The chief of staff is apparently being paged." She stopped walking. Not because it surprised her. She'd known it was coming since the Bay, since before the Bay, but because hearing it stated plainly out loud did something to the air, made the thing that had been abstract and future tense suddenly present and specific. She stood with her back to Garrett Lowe and her face toward the empty hallway, and she breathed for a moment, just breathed, not with any particular technique, just the way you breathe when you need to finish absorbing something before you can respond to it. "Okay," she said. "That's your whole reaction?" She turned. "What would you like my reaction to be?" He looked at her with that eyes-heavy expression again. "I don't know. Something." "I saved his life," she said. "Whatever happens after that is whatever happens after that." She said it plainly, not with resignation and not with bravado, just with the flatness of a fact she'd had long enough to examine from all sides. "Go get your arm imaged." She went back to the nursing station. The chief of staff arrived at 12:47 in the morning. His name was Dr. Philip Wharton, and Wren knew him the way she knew all the hospital administration, by sight and reputation and the specific way the air shifted when he walked through a department. He was 61, an internist by training, administrator by trajectory, with the careful affect of a man who had spent decades managing conflict by not fully committing to any position until he knew how it would land. He came through the ER entrance with Red beside him and a woman Wren didn't recognize carrying a tablet, and they went directly into the glass-walled conference room off the main nursing station. She was summoned 3 minutes later. The woman with the tablet turned out to be from hospital legal, young, composed, name badge reading Kay Ferris. She took notes without being asked and didn't speak unless directly addressed, which was the right call, and Wren respected the discipline of it, even though the presence of legal at 12:47 in the morning was not a good sign for how this conversation was going to go. Wharton spoke with the tone of someone who had already decided on the shape of the meeting before arriving. Nurse Carter, Dr. Red has filed a formal complaint documenting several serious concerns about your actions tonight. I want to give you the opportunity to respond before we proceed with next steps. What are the specific allegations? Wren asked. Wharton glanced at Red, who had positioned himself slightly apart, close enough to be present, far enough to look uninvolved. Unauthorized clinical decision-making, ordering controlled blood products without physician authorization, physical interference with the attending physician during an active resuscitation, practicing medicine outside the scope of your nursing license. Wren nodded once. I repositioned a tourniquet on a patient with an arterial bleed whose pressure was crashing. I requested activation of the massive transfusion protocol, which is within nursing scope at this facility per the MTP standing order signed by the department head. The blood products were ordered verbally by Dr. Red during the resuscitation. She looked at Red when she said this, steady and direct. I can produce my documentation. That's not what Red started. I have a timestamp on the order in the electronic record, Wren said. She had, in fact, documented everything, every action, every verbal order, every deviation, every rationale in the kind of precise clinical language that was either going to protect her or wasn't, but was at least accurate. If there's a discrepancy between Dr. Red's account and the medical record, the record reflects what occurred in the bay. Wharton cleared his throat. Regardless of the specifics, the ER doors opened. Not the main entrance, the ambulance bay doors, which opened from the outside and were coded for emergency personnel, and apparently for whoever had just come through them, because the man who walked in was in military uniform, full dress, with an aide at his shoulder and an expression that suggested he had not traveled to a regional hospital in Delwick, Montana, at 1 in the morning because he felt like a drive. He was perhaps 60, with close-cropped silver hair and the upright posture of someone whose spine had been trained into that shape over decades, and his uniform carried the insignia of a 2-star general, and he walked through the ER without pausing at the desk or asking for directions, which meant someone had already told him exactly where to go. He came to the open door of the conference room and stopped. General, Wharton stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall. Dr. Wharton. The general's voice was the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. He looked at Wharton, looked at Red, looked at the tablet and the woman holding it, and then his gaze moved to Wren and stayed there. And something shifted in it, something that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise, but was some combination of both. Wren Carter, he said. She held his gaze. General Aldous. The room was very quiet. General Frank Aldous, commander of the Special Operations Unit, whose injured soldier was currently in an OR upstairs, had last seen Wren Carter in a debrief room at a facility she was not cleared to name, at the end of a deployment she had been strongly advised never to discuss in detail. He had told her then, in the flat, factual tone that the military uses to deliver things that don't have adequate civilian language, that what she had done on the second night of the Courage extraction was the difference between a successful operation and a catastrophic loss, and that the Army would remember it. She had said, "I'd rather it just didn't come up again, sir." And he had looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode, and she had been discharged 3 months later on her own terms and had moved to Delwick, Montana, and that had been that, until now. My soldier, he said. In surgery, she said. Vascular repair of the femoral laceration. Dr. Vasquez is attending. Damage control resuscitation was initiated approximately 41 minutes before he went to the OR. His pressure was responding to the blood product protocol when they took him up. Aldous absorbed that in about 2 seconds, nodded once. Then he looked at Red. Red, to his credit, did not physically move, but something happened to his posture that was very close to what happens when a large animal registers a threat and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. I've been told, Aldous said, that a complaint has been filed against the individual responsible for keeping my soldier alive long enough to reach your operating room. General, there are procedural... I've been told, Aldous said again, with the particular patience of someone who has decided to say the same thing as many times as it takes, That a complaint has been filed. I'm asking you to confirm that." Wharton looked at Red. Red looked at the wall. "A complaint was filed," Wharton said carefully. "As a matter of standard protocol following an unusual—" "I want to be very precise about something," Aldous said. He still hadn't raised his voice. He wasn't going to raise his voice. "The individual who filed that complaint came within approximately 90 seconds of watching a United States Army Special Operations Staff Sergeant bleed out in your emergency bay due to incorrect resuscitation protocol. The individual standing across from him," he did not gesture toward Wren, but the meaning was clear, "is the reason that did not happen." He let that sit. "Now, walk me through what you're planning to do with the complaint." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Wren had heard all night. Wharton opened his mouth, and that was when the OR called. The overhead speaker, the internal line, not the radio, crackled, and the OR charge nurse's voice came through with the particular tension of someone working very hard to sound calm. "Dr. Wharton to OR2, urgent. Dr. Wharton to OR2. Wharton was already moving. Aldous was 2 steps behind him. Wren was up from her chair before either of them reached the door, because she knew what an urgent OR call at 1 in the morning sounded like, and she knew which patient was in OR2. And she was already running the possibilities through her head and not liking any of them. She made it to the OR corridor just behind the general, and the charge nurse met them at the scrub sink with a face that confirmed everything. "He's thrown a clot," she said. "DVT from the field. It's moving. Pulmonary embolism, forming, or already there, in the lungs of a man who had already spent 40 minutes in hemorrhagic shock. The combination was close to unsurvivable without immediate intervention, and the intervention required was aggressive anticoagulation in a patient who had just had a major vascular repair and whose surgical field was still open. It was, clinically speaking, a nearly impossible problem. Wren looked at the OR doors. She looked at General Aldous, who was looking at her with an expression she now recognized fully. It was the same expression he'd had in that debrief room 3 years ago, in the place she wasn't cleared to name. It was the expression of a man who was about to ask her to do something that shouldn't be possible. "Get me in there," Wren said. Aldous looked at Wharton. The look wasn't a request. Wharton hesitated for exactly the length of time it took him to understand that hesitating further was going to cost him more than moving, and then he said to the charge nurse, "Get her scrubbed in." Red, who had followed them down the corridor and was standing 6 feet back with the expression of a man watching something he'd built being dismantled piece by piece, said, "You cannot put a float nurse into an active surgical field. Dr. Red." Aldous turned to look at him with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. "I need you to stop talking now." Red stopped talking. The scrub sink was cold, and the soap was the harsh institutional kind that stripped everything off your hands, and Wren worked through the sequence the way she always worked through it. Methodical, complete. The brush moving in the pattern that had been drilled into her in a surgical training context that had nothing to do with the civilian OR she was standing outside. The charge nurse, her badge said Yolanda, held out a gown and gloves without comment, and Wren registered that Yolanda had already made her assessment and landed somewhere useful because there was no hesitation in the offer. No sideways look, just the practical efficiency of a surgical nurse who had decided the situation required a different kind of accounting than the org chart suggested. "Who's the attending in there?" Wren asked, letting Yolanda tie the gown. "Vasquez on the vascular repair, Mehran covering anesthesia. Vasquez just found the embolus on the intraoperative echo. It's a saddle PE sitting at the bifurcation. He's got partial obstruction of both main pulmonary arteries." Yolanda's voice was precise and flat. "They've been on the phone with the pulmonologist. Nobody wants to anticoagulate in an open vascular field." "Nobody should want to," Wren said, "but the alternative is worse. Vasquez knows that. He's stalling because he doesn't have a protocol for this exact combination, and he doesn't want to make the wrong call alone." She understood that. It wasn't cowardice. It was the particular weight of being the person who makes the irreversible decision when all the options are bad. And she had been that person enough times to know it sat differently than anything else. that you carried those decisions in a specific location in your body that didn't correspond to any anatomy she'd ever been taught. She pushed through the OR doors. The room was cold and very bright in the way OR rooms are always cold and very bright, and the smell hit her, that layered antiseptic and cautery smell that she associated with a completely different set of rooms in a completely different life. And Danny Holt was on the table with his right thigh open and Vasquez standing at the field with the stillness of a surgeon who has run out of easy moves. Vasquez looked up when she came in. He was 50, compact, with dark eyes that moved fast and processed faster, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been told something about her and was in the process of deciding how much of it to believe. "You're Carter," he said. "Yes." "Yolanda says you have a recommendation." "Catheter-directed thrombolysis," she said, moving to a position where she could see the field and the monitors simultaneously. "Low-dose TPA delivered directly to the clot through a pulmonary catheter. You preserve the thrombus targeting, you reduce the systemic lytic exposure, and you give the vascular repair the best chance of holding because you're not flooding the whole system with anticoagulant." Vasquez looked at her. "That's an interventional pulmonology procedure. I'm a vascular surgeon. And you're a nurse who has assisted with catheter-directed lysis in resource-limited environments where interventional pulmonology wasn't an option," she said. "The technique is the same. The equipment is different, but equivalent. I can walk you through it." A silence fell over the OR that had a specific quality. Not doubt, exactly, but the particular weight of a room full of trained people standing at the edge of something outside their normal operating range and deciding whether to step across. "His SAT is 84, the anesthesiologist, Meron, said from behind the drape. The voice was calm, but the number wasn't. 84% oxygen saturation in a patient on supplemental oxygen meant the embolus was already significantly compromising his pulmonary circulation. 84 was where the curve started going steep. "I can support him for maybe another 10 minutes at current status before I'm managing a cardiac arrest." 10 minutes. Vasquez made the decision the way surgeons make decisions when time has eliminated the luxury of deliberation. He made it and then immediately moved forward as if there had never been a question. "Talk me through it," he said. "Step by step. Don't skip anything." Wren moved to the instrument table and found what she needed, or the equivalents of what she needed, and she began. She talked, and Vasquez moved, and Meron managed the airway and the monitors, and the room operated with the compressed, wordless efficiency of people who are very good at their specific jobs, all doing their specific jobs simultaneously around a central problem. She had been in rooms like this before. She had been in rooms like this with worse lighting, worse equipment, worse odds, and more noise, and she had learned in those rooms that the way you stay useful is to stay narrow. Narrow your focus to the next step, the next action, the next decision point, and don't let the aggregate weight of the situation land on you until there's time to carry it. The catheter went in at the femoral vein. She guided Vasquez through the approach, while he worked with the precision of someone whose hands were trained for exactly this kind of fine vascular navigation. And they advanced it under fluoroscopic guidance toward the pulmonary bifurcation. And the progress was not fast, and it was not clean, and there was one moment where the catheter tip hung at the right atrium and refused to advance properly, and Vasquez said something under his breath in what she thought was Portuguese, and then adjusted his angle 2 degrees, and the catheter moved, and the room breathed again. "At the bifurcation," Vasquez said. "Confirm position on fluoro," Wren said, "before we push anything." He confirmed. The tip was positioned. She checked the image herself and then looked at Meron. "Saturation?" 81. Moving in the wrong direction. The clot was doing what saddle PS did when left in place. It was tightening its grip. "Lytic dose," she said. "Low concentration, slow push. We're watching the field the entire time." She looked at Vasquez's hands, which were at the vascular repair site, monitoring the integrity of the repair as the lytic agent would begin affecting the coagulation environment of the entire field. "Tell me immediately if you see any change in the anastomosis." "I will tell you," Vasquez said, with the dry precision of a man who didn't need to be told to do the thing he was already doing. The TPA went in slowly, very slowly. She counted it out, monitoring the concentration against the catheter volume, watching the clock, watching the monitors, watching Vasquez's hands at the field, watching Mayron's face behind the drape for any change in expression that would tell her something was happening before the numbers caught up. 3 minutes in, Mayron said, "SAT is 83. 1 point. It was 1 point. It was not enough to mean anything definitively, but it was the right direction, and she noted it and kept counting and kept watching. 5 minutes. 85, Mayron said. Vasquez exhaled, and she could see it in the set of his shoulders, even through the surgical gown. Field is holding. I'm not seeing any change at the anastomosis. 6 minutes. 87. 8 minutes. 91. Rate coming down. A pause, and she could hear something shift in Mayron's voice. Not relief exactly, but the loosening of something that had been very tightly held. He's perfusing. She stood at the instrument table with her hands at her sides, and she let herself feel the 91 for exactly 2 seconds, and then she said, "We'll need to continue the infusion for the next 2 hours at maintenance dose to make sure the clot dissolves fully. The vascular repair needs to be monitored every 15 minutes for the first hour. I'll write the post-procedure protocol and leave it with the charge." Vasquez looked at her across the table. He had the expression of someone who has just watched something and hasn't yet finished deciding what category it belongs to. "Where did you train?" he asked. It was the second time tonight someone had asked her that. "A lot of different places," she said, the same answer she'd given Geraldine, because it was accurate, and it was complete, and it didn't require her to say anything else. Vasquez looked at her for another moment, then nodded once and turned back to his field. "Yolanda," he said, "make sure Nurse Carter has access to whatever she needs for the post-procedure documentation." "Already on it," Yolanda said. Wren stepped back from the table. Her legs felt the hours now, the particular heavy tiredness that set in once the crisis had passed its peak and the body started submitting its bill for the adrenaline it had spent. She was aware of it as information, the way you're aware of a weather report, noted, relevant, not yet actionable. She stripped her gloves at the OR door and pushed through into the scrub corridor and found General Aldous standing outside with his aide and Garrett Lowe, who had apparently had his arm imaged and returned. She noted the sling, left arm, confirmed her earlier assessment, and all three of them looked at her with the same question on their faces. "He's perfusing," she said. Aldous closed his eyes for half a second. That was all. Then he opened them and said, "Thank you, Carter." "Vasquez did the procedure," she said. "He made the call." "He made the call because you told him what to call." She didn't argue with the accuracy of that. She was too tired for arguments that were only semantic. Garrett Lowe said, "What happens now?" "He'll be in the ICU for the next several days minimum. The femoral repair needs to hold. The lytic therapy needs to run its course, and his neurological status needs to be assessed once he's awake because we don't have a clean read on what 38 minutes of hemorrhagic shock did to his brain." She said it plainly because it was plain. "He's not out of it yet, but he's in it, which is better than where he was." Lowe nodded. He had the look of someone absorbing a thing they'd been bracing for and finding it slightly less terrible than expected, which was its own specific kind of exhaustion. "The complaint," Aldous said. "Is still filed," Wren said. "It won't stay filed." "With respect, General, it might." She met his eyes. "What I did tonight falls outside my scope of practice in about 4 different ways, documented and witnessed. Red is going to push this. He was looking for a reason before tonight. Tonight just gave him a bigger one." Aldous looked at her with the particular expression he'd worn in that debrief room 3 years ago. "You know I can make a phone call." "I know you can," she said. "I'd rather you didn't." He tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because I chose this life," she said. "The one I'm living here. I chose it deliberately, and I built it deliberately, and if it ends because I did the thing I was trained to do, then it ends on my terms." She said it without drama, the way you say things you've thought through completely. A phone call from you would save my job. It would also make everything I left behind follow me permanently. I'd rather face Red's complaint on its own merits." Aldous was quiet for a moment. "And if its own merits aren't enough, then they're not enough." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You were always the most difficult person I ever worked with." "I know," she said. "Sir." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, and she recognized it because she'd seen it in that debrief room too, in the last 10 seconds before she'd walked out. She went to find a chair and a charting station and wrote the post-procedure protocol for Holt's lytic infusion in language precise enough that any ICU nurse following it couldn't misinterpret a single step, and she documented her OR involvement in the same careful clinical prose she'd used for everything else tonight, and she was 2/3 through the documentation when Becca found her at 2:15 in the morning. Becca had the expression of someone who had been rehearsing what they were going to say and was still not sure it was the right thing. She was 26, competent and straightforward, with the quality of attention that good nurses developed early and cynical ones lost over time, and she sat down in the chair beside the charting station and didn't speak for a few seconds. "How's the patient?" she finally asked. "Stable. For now." "Red is in Wharton's office," Becca said. "They've been in there for 40 minutes. There are 2 people I don't recognize in the hallway outside. Suits, not hospital staff. And someone told me the floor supervisor got a call from the State Board's nightline." Wren stopped typing. The State Board's nightline was for emergencies, regulatory emergencies, the kind that warranted waking someone up at 2 in the morning and opening a file before morning business hours. She finished the sentence she was typing, saved the document, and sat back in the chair. "Carter," Becca said, "what did you do before this, before Harlow Peak?" "I was in the Army," Wren said. "For how long?" 17 years. Becca absorbed that. "Doing what?" "Keeping people alive in places they weren't supposed to survive." Becca was quiet for a moment. "Does that mean what I think it means?" "Probably." Another silence. Outside in the ER corridor, the normal machinery of a hospital night continued. A monitor alarming somewhere, a phone being answered, the distant roll of a cart. The sounds that had been the backdrop of Wren's last 11 months, ordinary and unremarkable and chosen, specifically chosen, because they were so far from what she'd known before. "For what it's worth," Becca said, "I watched what you did tonight, both things, the bay, and then—" She paused. "Yolanda told me about the OR. Yolanda talks. To the right people." Becca looked at her hands. "Everyone on the floor knows what happened. Red's side of it and yours." She looked up. "Most of them aren't on Red's side." Wren looked at her. "Most. A few are scared. He controls scheduling." Becca shrugged, honest about the economics of it. "But most—" It was the most anyone at Harlow Peak had said to her that functioned as support, and she didn't know exactly what to do with it because she hadn't built anything here that required support, hadn't wanted to, had specifically designed the last 11 months to not require anything from anyone around her. The fact that it was being offered anyway did something small and awkward to her chest that she didn't have adequate language for. "Go home," she said. "Your shift ended an hour ago." "I know." Becca stood. "You should eat something. There's food in the break room." She watched Becca go, and then she sat for a moment longer with her hands in her lap and the corridor sounds around her, and she thought about what Aldous had said, "the most difficult person I ever worked with." And she thought about Red in Wharton's office, building his case with the methodical patience of someone who knew how institutional processes worked and how to use them. And she thought about Danny Holt in the ICU at the end of the hall, with a repaired femoral artery and dissolving blood clots and a brain that was either intact or wasn't. And she thought, briefly and without any particular sentiment, about the life she had built here and what it would look like in the morning. Then she got up and went to check on her other patients, because there were people on this floor who had nothing to do with what had happened tonight and who still needed their vitals taken and their lines checked and their call buttons answered. And that was the job, and the job was still the job regardless of everything else. She was in room 318 checking on an elderly woman with a hip fracture, Mrs. Delacroix, 77, sharp as a tack, and not remotely interested in sleeping. when her pager went off at 3:41 in the morning. Not her nursing pager, the other one. The one she kept in the bottom of her locker in a waterproof case, powered on because you kept it powered on, or you didn't keep it. That was the implicit agreement. Even years after separation, even in Delwick, Montana, even in a life specifically designed to make it irrelevant. It had not gone off in 3 years. She looked at the number on the screen. She recognized the prefix. She was not supposed to recognize the prefix. The fact that she did told her something about the call that she would have preferred not to know at 3:41 in the morning after the night she'd already had. Mrs. Delacroix was watching her from the bed. "You look like someone just told you something bad." "I'm fine," Wren said automatically. "Honey," Mrs. Delacroix said, with the frankness of a woman who had been alive long enough to have no patience for polite fictions, "you look like you've been through a war tonight, and now whatever that is just made it worse." Wren looked at her. "I need to step out for a few minutes. Your call light is right here." "I know where my call light is. I'm 77, not helpless." She settled back against her pillow. "Go handle whatever it is." She went to the stairwell, because the stairwell was private and had no cameras on the landing below the first floor, which was a detail she had noted on her third day at Harlow Peak, the same way she noted all details about the layout of any space she occupied. She called back. It rang twice, and a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years said, "Carter, situation has changed." "I'm aware," she said. "Which part of the situation are you referring to?" Holt wasn't the primary on that bird. A pause that told her the pause was deliberate. "We had a secondary package, documents, 2 drives, and a hard copy manifest of an operation that's been running for 18 months. The bird went down before the handoff was complete." Her hand tightened on the phone. "Where is the package now?" "That's the problem." The voice on the other end was level and careful, in the way that voices get when the person speaking them is managing information in real time and deciding how much to release per sentence. "We think it's still in the wreckage on your roof." She looked at the ceiling of the stairwell, which was the underside of the first floor, concrete and pipes and silence. The burned helicopter. Still sitting on the north landing pad, with a package inside it that apparently mattered enough to wake up a number she wasn't supposed to recognize at 3:41 in the morning. "Who else knows it's there?" she said. Another pause. "That's the second problem," the voice said. "You need to tell me who else knows," Wren said. "We're working on that," the voice said. "What we know is the bird went down off the original flight path. Someone redirected them. We don't know if the redirect was compromised or if it was Lowe making a field call, but either way, the landing at your facility was not on any filed plan. Which means whoever was waiting for the package at the original drop doesn't know where it landed." "Correct. Which gives you a window. Small one." "How small?" "We're tracking 2 vehicles that left the original coordinates approximately 40 minutes after the bird went down. They'll be looking for the wreckage. At current speed and the road network in your area, we estimate 3 to 4 hours before they have a location." She checked her watch. 3:47. That put unknown vehicles at Harlow Peak sometime between 6:30 and 7 in the morning, which was shift change, which was when the building would be at its most populated and its most chaotic, which was either good cover or a disaster depending on who walked through the door and what they were willing to do in a building full of patients and staff. "I need Aldous," she said. "He's already being contacted through his own channel. But Carter, the general can't move on this without authorization that takes time he doesn't have. You're the one on the ground." She understood what that meant. She had understood it from the moment she recognized the prefix on the pager. It meant the call was information and the decision was hers, which was how it had always worked in the places she couldn't name, and which she had specifically and deliberately left behind, and which was apparently not done with her regardless. "The package," she said. "What exactly am I looking for?" The voice described it. Size, container type, markings. She filed the details in the part of her memory that stored operational specifics, the part that apparently hadn't atrophied in 3 years of float nursing. "One more thing," the voice said. She waited. "The manifest in that package has names on it. People who've been feeding targeting information to a network we've been trying to roll up for 18 months. Some of those names are institutional, medical, logistics, civilian contractor." A pause. "We don't know yet if any of them are local." She stood in the stairwell and let that land. Local. in Delwick, in a facility where a military helicopter had just happened to go down. The redirect, she said slowly. You said someone redirected the flight path. Yes. Lowe filed the in-flight emergency. The redirect would have been coordinated through regional air traffic. Whoever took that coordination call would have known the new destination. A silence that confirmed she'd gotten there on her own, and the voice didn't need to lead her further. I'll call back, she said, and ended it. She stood for a moment in the concrete quiet of the stairwell and thought about the night she'd had and added this to it. The way you add a weight to a scale that's already tipping, and she breathed through it in the same way she'd breathed through everything else tonight. Not evenly, not perfectly, just enough. And then she went back upstairs because the package was on the roof, and the roof was accessed through the building, and she needed to think about that clearly before she moved. She found Garrett Lowe in the ICU family waiting area, sitting in a plastic chair with his slung arm across his lap and a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk going cold on the side table. He looked up when she came around the corner, and something in his posture shifted, not alarm exactly, but the alertness of someone whose baseline was already running high. I need to ask you something, she said, and pulled a chair to face him rather than sitting beside him, because she wanted to see his face when she asked. The redirect. When you filed the in-flight emergency and changed course for Harlow Peak, was that your call or did someone advise it? He looked at her steadily. My call. Holt was critical. Harlow Peak was the closest facility on the network for trauma-capable landing. I made the decision in under 30 seconds. Did you tell anyone before you landed? I transmitted through standard emergency frequency. Anyone monitoring would have heard it. He paused. That's a standard procedure. I know. She studied his face. He wasn't lying. The details were too clean, and his eyes were doing what people's eyes did when they were recalling rather than constructing. But the fact of the standard transmission mattered. The package is still on the roof. Something shifted in his expression. Carter, I know about the package, she said. I know what's in it, and I know there are people looking for the wreckage. We have a few hours. He set down the coffee. How do you know? Same way you know to keep a backup pager charged even 3 years after separation. She held his gaze. I need you to get Aldous, and I need you to meet me on the roof in 10 minutes. Don't go through the main desk and don't tell anyone else where you're going. She didn't wait for his answer because she didn't need it. He was already recalibrating, already moving in the direction of the decision. She could see it happening. And she went to her locker and pulled on the extra set of scrubs she kept there and changed out of the ones that had Holt's blood on them. Not because she had time to be particular about it, but because what she was about to do required a clear head and walking around in a dead man's blood. He wasn't dead, she corrected herself, not dead, fighting, was a weight she didn't need added to this specific hour. She took the stairwell to the roof. The fire suppression crews had done their work in the first hour after the crash. The burning section of the undercarriage was out. The fuel pooling had been contained, and someone had thrown barriers around the helicopter perimeter. The orange plastic kind that hospitals kept in facilities management closets for exactly the kind of situation where the official incident response hadn't caught up with the physical reality yet. The barriers weren't locked. She stepped around one and moved toward the helicopter in the pre-dawn dark, the mountains visible as a slightly darker black against the sky to the west. The Black Hawk's fuselage had crumpled on the port side, the side that had caught the equipment housing on impact, and the cargo area was accessible through the starboard door, which had been partially thrown open by the crash, and had jammed in that position. She got her shoulder into it and forced it another 8 inches and squeezed through. Inside smelled like fuel and burnt composite, and the particular chemical residue of fire suppression foam, and it was very dark, and she used her phone's light because she didn't have anything better and had made do with worse. The cargo area was sparse, military transport configuration, minimal gear rigged along the starboard wall, most of it shifted and scattered by the impact. She worked methodically from the aft bulkhead forward, checking beneath the shifted equipment, behind the seat base, along the floor channels where cargo could slide and lodge in a hard landing. She found it behind the co-pilot's seat, wedged under the seat base frame and half buried under a scatter of emergency gear that had come loose from the forward storage net. A hard-sided case, gray, the size of a large book, with a foam handle and two combination locks and a small pressure indicator on the side that showed the seal was intact. She recognized the type. She had transported similar cases in similar aircraft in a completely different set of circumstances. She pulled it free, and it came loose with the resistance of something that had been jammed by impact stress. And she sat back on her heels in the dark fuselage and held it and thought for 2 seconds about what she was holding and what it meant and what came next, and then she heard the roof door open. She went still. The footsteps were not Lowe's. She knew Lowe's footstep pattern from the corridor earlier. He moved right heavy, favoring his uninjured arm instinctively, a specific rhythm. These footsteps were two people, both moving carefully, the deliberate quiet of people who were trying to be quieter than normal and weren't quite managing it because the roof surface was gravel and composite debris and impossible to cross silently. She looked at the case in her hands. She looked at the jammed door on the far side of the fuselage, which would take 5 seconds she didn't have to force open. She looked at the darkness of the cargo space around her and made a decision in the same compressed, options-eliminated way she had made decisions in other dark spaces over 17 years. She stayed still. The footsteps stopped at the barrier perimeter. A voice, male, low, said something she couldn't fully make out, and a second voice responded, and then there was the sound of the barrier being moved. They were coming into the perimeter. She set the case down quietly and positioned herself forward of it, between the case and the jammed door, and she waited with the particular quality of stillness she had developed a long time ago, the kind that wasn't held breath and clenched muscles, but something closer to the inverse, a deliberate loosening of every non-essential tension in the body, saving it, because she might need it in a moment. The starboard door, the one she'd come through, was 8 inches open. Light from one of their phones swept through the gap and moved across the interior and stopped. It had stopped on the case. "It's in there?" the first voice said. Wren came through the door. She hit the frame with her shoulder going out, and the door gave the remaining distance, and she was on the roof surface with both people in front of her, closer than she'd expected, which was the bad news, not yet reaching for anything, which was the better news. 2 men, civilian clothing, one holding a phone and one with his hands free, both surprised by the door opening toward them faster than they'd expected, which gave her approximately 1 second of initiative that she used. She didn't escalate beyond what the situation required. She put the man with the free hands on the ground with a controlled takedown that used his own momentum and the uneven roof surface, and she got between him and the case, and she said to the man with the phone, "Drop the phone and put your hands where I can see them." He didn't drop the phone. She looked at him. He was maybe 40, unremarkable, the face of someone who spent time in rooms and not in fields, and he was running the calculation she could see him running. She was one person. There were 2 of them. The man on the ground was already starting to get up. "Don't!" she said to the man on the ground. Not loudly. He stopped. The roof door opened again and Garrett Lowe came through it, and behind him General Aldous, and behind Aldous 2 of his aides colleagues she hadn't seen before tonight. And the arithmetic on the roof changed completely. The man with the phone looked at the general's uniform and something went out of him all at once, the way air goes out of a thing when the seal is broken. "Hands," Aldous said. He dropped the phone. What followed was not fast and it was not dramatic, which was how these things actually went when they went correctly. A controlled, methodical process of securing, identifying, and beginning the chain of custody that would eventually resolve into a federal matter handled by people with more specific authority than anyone currently on this rooftop. Aldous had made the calls he'd needed to make in the hour since she'd spoken to him, and the people he'd reached were already moving, and the 2 men in civilian clothing were going to have a very difficult morning in a very specific kind of room that Wren had personal familiarity with from the other side of the table. She stood aside and let the process happen. Lowe came to stand next to her. His arm was still in the sling, his face showing the accumulated cost of the night in the way faces did when the adrenaline debt came due, the specific hollowness around the eyes and the tightness at the jaw. He looked at the case she was holding and then at her. "You found it." "It was behind the co-pilot seat," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Those 2 weren't operators, they were intel support, which means whoever sent them knows the operation better from the inside than from the outside," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "The manifest." "I haven't opened it. She held the case out to him. "I'm not cleared for it. I was never cleared for it." He took it, and she watched him take it, and she felt something release in her chest that had been held tightly since the stairwell. The thing you hold when you're carrying something that isn't yours, and you can't put it down until someone with the right hand shows up to take it. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten. Not sunrise yet, just the suggestion of it, the specific shade of dark blue that preceded dawn in the mountains, and Harlow Peak's rooftop lights made the surrounding sky look darker by contrast, and she could see the shape of the crashed helicopter clearly now for the first time, without smoke and fire obscuring it, the crumpled port side and the sheared tail, the strange stillness of a machine that had been moving very fast and was now completely stopped. "Carter," Aldous said from behind her. She turned. He was standing with his hands at his sides, the aide slightly behind him, and he had the expression of a man who had arrived at a conversation he'd been building toward for the last 3 hours. "There are going to be federal investigators here by 0800. They're going to want to talk to you." "I know." "They're also going to encounter Dr. Philip Wharton and a formal complaint filed by Dr. Marcus Red, which is going to be difficult to separate from everything else that happened tonight once the scope of this becomes clear." He paused. "I want you to let me handle Red." She looked at him. "I told you. I know what you told me. I'm telling you that what happened in your ER tonight isn't separate from what happened on this roof. The same operation that brought Holt here is going to be investigated end to end, and that investigation is going to include how your facility responded, and that means how your chief of emergency medicine responded. And that means his choices tonight are going to be examined by people who don't care about hospital hierarchy." He held her gaze. "That's not me making a phone call. That's the process doing what the process does." She thought about that. It was a real distinction, and she knew it. The difference between a general using personal influence to squash an administrative complaint and a federal investigation that would examine the events of the night and reach its own conclusions. The first would have owed her something she didn't want. The second owed her nothing, and went where the evidence led. "All right," she said. He nodded once. The sun was coming. She went back inside because she had patients to check and documentation to complete, and a shift that was technically still in progress. And she went through the now familiar service stairs and the hallways she'd spent 11 months memorizing, past the nursing station where the overnight charge was handing off to the day shift, past the ICU corridor where Danny Holt was, past the ER bay that still smelled faintly of the trauma of a few hours ago, and she found the locker room and sat down on the bench and took her shoes off and looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing she'd never been able to explain to people who hadn't done what she'd done. The hands weren't steady because she wasn't scared. They were steady because the training ran below the level where fear had traction, and the steadiness was not proof of anything except that the training worked. It said nothing about what happened afterward, in the quiet, when the hands had nothing to do and the mind went back through it. She sat with that for a moment and then put her shoes back on and went to check on her patients. The federal investigators arrived at 7:52, which was 8 minutes before Aldous had estimated, and 40 minutes after Dr. Wharton had received his first call from a number he apparently hadn't expected. She was in the middle of a medication reconciliation on the hip fracture patient, Mrs. Delacroix, who was eating breakfast and had opinions about the eggs, when Becca appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone carrying news that had weight to it. "There are people in Wharton's office," Becca said. "Suits, badges, and the state board rep who was apparently already here for the complaint against you is now also in that meeting." She paused. "And Red got Page to come in at 7:30. He's been in the administrator's suite for the last hour." "I know," Wren said. "You know?" "I know," she said again, and finished the medication reconciliation and said to Mrs. Delacroix, "I'll be back before your PT session." "Take your time, honey," Mrs. Delacroix said. "Something tells me your morning is more complicated than mine." She found Garrett Lowe outside the ICU at 8:15. He had evidently not slept and had no plans to. He was standing at the window that looked into the unit, where Danny Holt was visible through the glass, still intubated, monitor cables and IV lines, the specific landscape of someone in the ICU who was alive and fighting for what came next. "Any update from the team?" she asked. His ICP looks okay. They're going to try to wean the vent this afternoon. Lowe kept his eyes on the glass. Vasquez thinks the vascular repair is solid. If the lytic therapy finishes the clot clearance without triggering the anastomosis, he's probably looking at recovery rather than amputation. Probably, she said, because probably was the only honest word. Probably is good, he said. They stood for a moment in the particular quiet of an ICU corridor, which was not actually quiet but was quieter than everything else, a managed hush that the building maintained around its sickest patients. The manifest, she said. What's in it? He looked at her. You said you weren't cleared. I'm not. I'm asking anyway. He was quiet for a moment. 17 names. People embedded at various levels of logistics and medical supply chains for 2 different military installation networks. They've been passing inventory information, specifically pharmaceutical and medical equipment shipment manifests, that allowed a third party to intercept and redirect materiel. He paused. It's not a spy thriller. It's theft. Very organized, very damaging, and the reason 2 operations in the last year ran into supply problems that cost people in the field. He paused again. Cost some people more than supplies. She thought about that, about operations running into supply problems, about what supply problems looked like when you were the one needing the supplies. Any of the names local, she said. He looked at her, and she knew from the half second before he answered that the answer was yes. 1, he said, a logistics coordinator, civilian contractor attached to the regional medical supply network that covers a 6-hospital corridor. He paused. Including Harlow Peak. She looked at the floor. She thought about the in-flight emergency transmission on the standard frequency. She thought about 2 men in civilian clothing on a hospital roof at 4 in the morning who had known exactly where to look for a crashed helicopter and exactly what they were looking for inside it. They knew Holt was here because someone heard the transmission and flagged it to the network, she said. That's what the investigators think. And the complaint Red filed, the timing. She said it slowly, working through it. He filed it within an hour of Holt arriving, which would have been the same window. The investigators are looking at everything from the last 6 hours, Lowe said carefully, including the complaint and who might have had an interest in creating administrative chaos in this facility at a specific moment. She looked at him. Are you telling me Red is on the manifest? I'm telling you the investigators are looking at everything, he said, with a precision that was its own kind of answer. The world reordered itself around that sentence. Not dramatically, not with noise. The way things reordered themselves when a piece of information you'd been holding in the wrong frame suddenly went into the right one, and everything adjacent to it shifted accordingly. Marcus Red, who had blocked her at every turn and filed the complaint at a time that would have tied the hospital administration in knots precisely when federal investigators were arriving, who had pushed her out of the trauma bay at the specific moment Holt's survival was most in question, who had spent 11 months making her small and invisible and easily removable. She did not say anything for a moment, because there was too much inside the moment to put into sentences. It might not be him, Lowe said. It might be someone adjacent, someone who told him something or used something he filed for a different reason. It might not be him, she agreed. But she thought about how he had looked at her in the conference room at 12:47 in the morning, with the particular calculation of a man who needed her removed from the building and was using the tools available to him. And she thought about the timing, and she thought about 11 months of being called dead weight. Down the hall, a door opened, and one of the suits she'd seen going into Wharton's office appeared in the corridor and looked in her direction. And then he looked at Lowe, and then he started walking toward them with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided it is time for a specific conversation. And behind him, visible through the open door down the hall, she could see Marcus Red sitting across from 2 other investigators, and his face had lost the authority it wore on ordinary days, and he was holding his phone with both hands in the way people held things when they needed an anchor, and whatever he was being told was clearly not going in the direction he had expected when he filed his complaint at 1 in the morning and walked into the administrator's office believing he was still the one with all the leverage. The investigator reached them and extended a badge briefly and said, "Nurse Carter, I'm Special Agent Dara Wills. I'd like to speak with you about the events of last night, including some additional context that's developed in the last few hours." She paused. You're not under investigation. You're a witness. But what you saw and heard matters, and I need it on record. Wren looked at the badge, looked at the investigator's face, and then looked back down the hall at the open door and the man inside it, who had spent 11 months making her feel like a problem to be managed, rather than a person doing a job. I have a few patients I need to hand off first, she said. Of course, the agent said. She went to do that, properly, completely, the way handoffs were supposed to be done. Not fast and incomplete because something else demanded her attention. Because that was the job, and the job mattered regardless of what was happening in the administrator's suite. And when she came back, Wills was waiting in the same spot, and the door down the hall was closed now. And from behind it, she could hear nothing, which was somehow louder than anything she'd heard all night. The interview with Special Agent Wills lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. It took place in the small conference room off the radiology suite, which was the only space in the building that was both private and not currently occupied by federal personnel. And Wills conducted it the way experienced investigators conducted interviews. Not with aggression, not with obvious strategy, but with the patient, accumulative attention of someone building a structure one brick at a time, placing each question where it needed to go, and then waiting, genuinely waiting, for the answer to settle before the next one came. Wren told her everything. The sequence in the ER, the tourniquet and the resuscitation, and Red's orders and her countermeasures, and the OR and the lytic protocol. She told it in the flat clinical language she'd used for her documentation. And when Wills asked her to expand on specific moments, she expanded on them. And when Wills asked about the pager and the rooftop, she told that too, all of it, because she had decided in the elevator on the way to this room that there was no version of selective disclosure that served her, and there was no version of her story that needed to be managed, because the story was what it was, and it was true. Wills took notes on a tablet and recorded the session with a device she placed on the table between them without asking if that was acceptable, which Wren noted but didn't object to, because she had nothing to say that she wouldn't want recorded. At one point, Wills asked, "When Dr. Red first filed the complaint, what did you think was going to happen?" Wren considered the question honestly. "I thought I was probably going to lose the job." "And that was acceptable to you?" "I saved a man's life. Whatever came after that was whatever came after that." She paused. "That's not noble. It's just math. The alternative was watching someone die in order to keep a position I'd been trying to stay invisible in for 11 months. Wills looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who was not strictly required to have an opinion about what they were hearing, but had developed one anyway. "Why were you trying to stay invisible?" "Because I'd had enough of being visible," Wren said. Visible meant deployments, decisions with no good options, carrying things that didn't have anywhere to go afterward. She said it simply. "I wanted ordinary." "Did you get it?" "For 11 months, Wren said. "More or less." Wills looked back at her tablet. "One more thing. In your assessment, from what you observed over 11 months, was Dr. Red's behavior toward you and other staff members consistent with someone who had an external interest in keeping the float pool compliant and the ER chain of command unquestioned?" It was a carefully worded question. Wren recognized the care in it. "I can tell you what I observed," she said. "I can tell you that his hostility toward me increased after I demonstrated clinical competency, not before. I can tell you that he built cases against staff who questioned his decisions, and that the pattern was consistent across multiple nurses over multiple months." She met Wills's eyes. "What that means in the context of your investigation, I'll let you determine." Wills nodded and made a note and said, "That's everything for now. You may be contacted for follow-up." "I know," Wren said. She stood, and the chair scraped on the tile floor, and she stretched her back, which ached with the particular insistence of a body that had been through a long night and was done being polite about it. And she picked up the cold coffee she'd carried in and hadn't touched. And she looked at Wills, who was reviewing something on her tablet. "Can I ask you something?" Wren said. Wills looked up. "The logistics coordinator on the manifest. How long?" Wills was quiet for a moment. "We believe approximately 14 months. 14 months. 1 month longer than Wren had been at Harlow Peak. She thought about that and what it meant, that the network had been operating in this corridor before she arrived, that her 11 months of careful invisibility had been spent in a building that was already compromised, that the ordinary she'd chosen had not been as separate from what she'd left as she'd believed. She didn't say any of that. She just nodded once and walked out. The hospital had changed in the hours she'd been in the interview room. She felt it as soon as she stepped into the main corridor, not in anything visible exactly, but in the atmosphere, the particular quality of tension that a workplace carried when everyone knew something significant had happened and was processing it differently based on where they stood relative to the thing. Nurses who passed her made eye contact in a way they hadn't yesterday. An orderly she'd worked alongside for months stopped and said, "Heard what you did last night," and then didn't add anything to it, which was its own kind of statement. The charge nurse at the main desk looked up when she walked past and gave her a small, deliberate nod. She went to check on Holt. The ICU charge told her they'd begun the ventilator wean at 10 that morning and he was tolerating it. His pressure was stable. The vascular repair was holding. The lytic therapy had run its course overnight, and the follow-up imaging showed the clot burden significantly reduced, not gone entirely, but no longer obstructing flow. His neurological assessment when they'd done a brief trial off sedation at 0800 had shown purposeful movement in all extremities, an appropriate response to voice, which was, she heard the charge nurse use the word remarkable and understood what it was measuring against. She stood at the ICU window for a while and looked at him. 26 years old. She had carried him out of a burning vehicle when he was 22 4 years ago, in a country she still couldn't name in a public context, and she had thought about him occasionally in the years since in the way you thought about the ones you weren't sure had made it. Not obsessively, not with grief, but with a specific quality of not knowing that sat at the back of things. Now she knew. He had made it. He was making it again. She didn't go in. He needed rest, and he didn't need her standing over him, and there was nothing clinical she could add that his care team wasn't already doing correctly. She just needed to see him with her own eyes in the daylight, and she had done that, and she turned and walked back toward the main floor. She was at the nursing station completing the documentation. She'd had to pause for the interview when Philip Wharton appeared in the corridor at 11:40 with the expression of a man who had spent 4 hours in a room with federal investigators and had come out the other side with a significantly revised understanding of the situation he was managing. He stopped in front of the nursing station. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, "Nurse Carter, do you have a few minutes?" It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite a command either, which was different from how he'd spoken to her at 12:47 the previous night, and she noted the difference without making anything of it. "After I finish this documentation," she said. He waited. She finished. Then she followed him to his office, which was a corner room on the administrative floor with the particular blankness of an office that had been professionally decorated and never personalized. And he sat behind his desk, and she sat across from it, and he folded his hands on the surface between them. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited to hear what kind. "I allowed a process to move forward last night that I should have slowed down. The complaint was filed, and I responded to the urgency of the moment rather than the substance of what had happened." He held her gaze, which she gave him credit for. "I was managing a physician I've had concerns about for some time by not confronting those concerns, and last night that dereliction became visible in a way I couldn't ignore." He paused. "That's not adequate as an explanation. I'm offering it as context." "I understand context," she said. "The complaint is withdrawn. That was formalized this morning." He paused again. "That's not the only thing being formalized this morning." She looked at him steadily. "Dr. Red is on administrative leave effective as of 8 a.m., pending the outcome of the federal investigation and a parallel internal review of his conduct over the last 14 months. The board met by phone at 9 this morning and authorized the suspension." He took a breath. "That review will include examination of staff complaints that were filed and then closed through processes I'm going to be examining very carefully." Wren thought about the nurses who had filed complaints that had gone nowhere, about the float pool turnover that everyone accepted as normal, about the specific way Red had operated, not by formal power alone, but by the accumulated pressure of a dozen small moves that added up to an environment where questioning him cost more than staying quiet. "There are people on this floor who've been documenting things for a long time," she said, "who didn't get anywhere because the documentation went to him or to people who deferred to him. I know, Wharton said, and he said it with the weight of someone who was only now fully acknowledging what knowing meant. I'm aware of at least 4 situations. There may be more. The review will go back 30 months. She sat with that for a moment. 30 months. People who had been trying to do the right thing in this building for 30 months and had been shut down, rerouted, quietly managed out, while the man managing them continued to practice with the authority and impunity of someone who had learned that institutions protected their own structures more fiercely than they protected the people inside them. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I'd like you to consider staying," he said. "Not in the float pool. We have a trauma education role that's been unfilled for 2 years. The board approved the position before I was in this seat, and it was never seriously recruited because we didn't have the clinical leadership to build the program around." He looked at her. "I think we do now." She looked back at him. Trauma education. Developing protocol. Training staff. Specifically integrating pre-hospital and field medicine principles into civilian trauma response. He paused. "Several of our nurses who were in the ER last night told me this morning that they had never seen some of what they saw last night, that it changed how they understood their own practice." He said it carefully, like a man choosing honest language over administrative language. That knowledge should be in this building permanently, not passing through. She thought about what Becca had said at 2 a.m. "I watched what you did tonight," and about Yolanda in the OR, who had made a decision about her in about 3 seconds and acted on it without requiring external authorization, and about Pollard, the resident who had brought the thoracic tray without being asked to open it. She thought about what it would mean to stay, and what it would mean to leave, and what ordinary looked like now on the other side of a night like this one. "I'll think about it," she said. It wasn't yes and it wasn't no, and Wharton seemed to understand that, because he nodded once and didn't push, and she left his office and walked back to the floor. The formal announcement of Red's suspension came at 2 p.m. It came through the department heads first, and then through a hospital-wide communication that went to all clinical staff, and it was phrased in the language of administrative processes and pending reviews, which was appropriate and also inadequate as a description of what had happened. But that was institutional language. It covered what it needed to cover and left the rest to the people who had been there. She was in the break room getting coffee when the notification came through on the floor tablets, and she watched the staff around her read it. And she watched their reactions, which were varied and complicated in the way reactions to the removal of a powerful person were always varied and complicated, because institutions were not simple, and people in them were not simple, and 11 months of watching Red operate had taught her that he was skilled enough to have cultivated genuine allies alongside the people he'd simply managed through fear. But the predominant reaction, across the nursing staff and the techs and the residents she could see through the break room doorway, was something that looked less like celebration and more like the release of a held breath that had become so normal nobody remembered holding it. Becca came into the break room at 2:15 with 2 cups of coffee she hadn't needed, which meant she'd wanted a reason to come in, and the coffee was the pretext. "Did you hear?" she said. "I heard," Wren said. Becca sat down across from her. She turned her cup around in her hands, the habitual fidget of someone working up to something. 3 nurses filed HR complaints last year, against Red. All 3 were either transferred out or left voluntarily within 2 months. She looked up. "I know one of them. She left the profession entirely." Wren didn't say anything. She let that sit where it needed to sit. "She's going to find out about this," Becca said. "About what happened last night and what they found." She paused. "I don't know if that helps anything." "It probably doesn't undo it," Wren said, "but it changes what it means." She looked at her coffee. Someone being held accountable is different from the thing not happening. It doesn't reach back, but it changes what happens from here. Becca was quiet for a moment. "You knew last night was going to cost you something, before you did any of it." "I knew it might." "And you did it anyway." Wren looked at her. There was something genuine in Becca's face, not hero worship. Becca was too practically minded for that, but something more honest, the look of someone who was trying to understand a calculation they hadn't encountered before. The one where you chose the thing that cost you because the alternative was something you couldn't live with. "I didn't do it to be brave," Wren said. I did it because I knew how, and he was dying and the window was closing. That's all. She paused. The cost was a real consideration. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't. But it wasn't enough to stop you. No, she said. It wasn't enough to stop me. Becca nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing something away. Then she picked up one of the coffees she hadn't needed and drank some of it, and they sat together in the break room for a few minutes without any particular agenda, which was its own kind of thing, in a building that had been running at maximum intensity for the better part of 20 hours. The call from Wills came at 4:17. Update, Wills said. The logistics coordinator has been taken into federal custody. 2 additional individuals connected to the network were apprehended this morning at a facility 3 hours south of you. The manifest is in federal custody and authentication is in progress. A pause. Dr. Red is not on the manifest. Wren stood at the window of the stairwell landing where she'd taken the call, looking out at the parking structure and the mountains beyond it. But, she said, because there was a but in the pause. But his financial records, which we accessed pursuant to the federal investigation, show a pattern of payments from a consulting entity that traces back to the logistics network. He wasn't feeding intelligence. He was being paid to create administrative conditions that made compliance oversight in his department easier to manage. Another pause. In plain terms, he was paid to be exactly the kind of department chief he was. Hostile to staff who questioned him, insulated from external review, effective at suppressing internal dissent. She thought about that, about what it meant that his contempt had been, in some part, a service he was rendering, that the specific texture of how he'd treated her and others had not just been personality, it had been function. How long, she said, at least 22 months. 22 months of a department run as a tool of someone else's interests, and the people who tried to push back on it had been pushed out, and it had been allowed to continue because the institution had its own reasons for not looking too hard at a physician who delivered results and didn't create visible public problems. What happens to him, she said. Suspension pending investigation will become termination pending the federal findings. The state medical board has opened a parallel review. Depending on what the financial forensics show, there may be criminal referral for wire fraud and conspiracy. It won't be resolved quickly. Wills paused. These things rarely are. I know, Wren said. But it will be resolved, Wills said, and said it with the specific weight of someone who had done this long enough to know the difference between the cases that resolved and the ones that didn't. After she hung up, she stood at the window for a while. She thought about 22 months, about the nurses who had left the profession, about the complaints that had been closed and the people who had filed them and moved on or given up or quietly adjusted their expectations of what an institution could offer them by way of protection. About the specific loneliness of knowing you're right and having no mechanism through which that rightness can become a visible, documented, consequential fact. She had been lucky in a way that she recognized clearly and without false modesty. She had walked into a night that had blown the structure open from the outside, that had brought federal investigators and a military general and a set of circumstances so far outside the normal operating parameters of Harlow Peak that the usual mechanisms for suppressing inconvenient truths had simply not had room to function. Without all of that, without the helicopter, without Holt, without the package and the manifest and the network that had been 18 months in the unraveling, she would have faced a complaint process that Red knew how to run and Wharton knew how to defer to, and she would have lost. And the things she'd done in that ER would have been buried under paperwork, and she would have eventually moved to the next facility and tried again to be invisible. She had been lucky. But Danny Holt was alive, and the complaints that had been filed and closed were now in a federal investigator's record, and the pattern they described was now documented evidence rather than individual grievances that could be managed one at a time. And the people who had been pushed out of this building by a system working against them were going to find out that the system had been exposed, and she couldn't control what that meant for each of them. But it meant something, and something was different from nothing, and she had been in enough situations to know that different from nothing was not a small thing. She pushed off from the window ledge and went back to the floor. Danny Holt was extubated the following morning. She wasn't there for it. She heard about it from Yolanda, who had come down from the OR for a different procedure and stopped by the nursing station with the information delivered in the same precise, unhurried way Yolanda delivered all information. Your patient in the ICU is breathing on his own. Vasquez says the repair looks clean. He's not my patient, Wren said. Yolanda looked at her with the expression of someone who didn't have time for semantic arguments. He's breathing on his own, she said again, and walked away. She went up to the ICU at the end of her shift. He was awake. That was the first thing. The specific quality of a face that was conscious and present rather than medicated and somewhere else. The eyes tracking and the recognition working, even through the obvious cost of 48 hours of critical illness that showed in his color and his posture and the way he held himself carefully, aware of the repair in his leg, aware of the tubes recently removed, aware of the fragility of what he was sitting inside. He looked at her when she came to the door, and his face did the thing that faces did when they were processing something they'd been holding, a recognition, a relief, and underneath both of those something that was harder to name, the specific gratitude that came not from receiving a gift, but from being given back something that was already yours. "Hey," he said. His voice was rough from the tube, the first word abraded and effortful. "Hey," she said. She came into the room and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment in the way that people who have been in extreme circumstances together sometimes didn't need to say anything, because the shared knowledge of the thing sat between them and covered the ground that words would have taken longer to walk. "Raven," he said. "Carter," she said. "Here." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if his ribcage had been up to it. "Carter," he agreed. "You're a nurse." "Float nurse. Linen assignments." "Right." His eyes were tired but clear. "Lo told me some of what happened, after I was out." He paused, the effort of speaking visible. "You should have let them kick you out when Red said to." "Probably," she said. "You never did know how to follow a bad order." "I know how to follow them," she said. "I just don't always choose to." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to say the next thing. "I kept track of you," he said, "after I got out of the hospital the first time. Delwick showed up in your record, and I thought, she found somewhere to be quiet. I thought that was good." He paused. "I'm sorry we brought all of this here." She looked at him. She thought about what to say to that, about the version of herself that had arrived in Delwick 11 months ago, wanting nothing more than a small footprint and clean work and the mountains in the window, and about what that version would say to this version, standing in an ICU at the end of a very long 2 days. "Don't be sorry," she said. "It needed to be here." He looked at her, and she thought he understood what she meant. Not just the operational piece, not just the package and the manifest and the network, but the other thing, the thing that had been running underneath the whole night, the accumulated weight of what had been wrong in this building, and the fact that it had been wrong and operational at the same time, and one of those conditions had to yield. "What happens now?" he said. "You heal," she said. "That's your job for the next several weeks." "And you?" She thought about Wharton's offer, about the unfilled role, about Becca's face in the break room and Yolanda in the OR and Pollard, who had brought the thoracic tray, and the charge nurse who had looked at her in the corridor with something that was close to respect. About the nurses who had filed complaints that had been closed, and who deserved to know that what they'd documented was now part of a record that could not be quietly managed. "I'm going to stay for a while," she said. He seemed to absorb that. "Delwick." "Delwick," she said. "It's still quiet, mostly." He made the almost laugh sound again. "You'll fix that." "I'll try not to," she said. And she meant it, mostly. She left him to rest because he needed rest more than he needed conversation, and she walked back through the ICU corridor in the main hallway and down the stairwell she'd taken a dozen times in the last 2 days, past the OR level and the ER level, and out through the side entrance into the Montana afternoon, which was cold and clear, and smelled like the specific combination of pine resin and high-altitude dryness that she had learned over 11 months without meaning to. She stood outside for a few minutes. The mountains were the same as they always were, indifferent and permanent and enormous, in the way that things were enormous when they predated everything human by enough distance that the comparison became meaningless. She had looked at them from the break room window, on her first day at Harlow Peak and thought, "Here is something that will not require anything from me." And she had found that restful, and she still did. But it sat differently now, the way things sat differently once you'd stopped pretending you could live completely outside the reach of your own history. The truth was that she had never fully wanted to disappear. She had wanted to stop being used up. She had wanted to choose when and where and for whom she spent the things she had, the knowledge, the skill, the specific capability that she'd built across 17 years of doing work that most people would never know existed. She had wanted it to be her choice, made in her own time, on her own terms. Last night had not been her terms, but it had been her choice, and that, she thought, standing outside a regional hospital in Montana with sore legs and a back that was going to complain for days, and the accumulated exhaustion of a night that had covered more ground than most years, was the distinction that mattered. Not whether the circumstances were what she'd planned, not whether the cost was what she'd budgeted, but whether, at each moment when the decision arrived, she had been the one making it. She had been. She pulled out her phone and called the number Wharton had given her that morning. He answered on the second ring. "I'll take the position," she said, "but I want to design the curriculum. The protocols come from clinical evidence and field-validated techniques, not institutional preference. And I want full access to staff complaint history going back 30 months, because whatever I build in this department needs to function in the actual culture of this building, not the version of it that lives on paper." A pause. "Those are significant conditions." "Yes," she said. Another pause. "All right," he said. "We'll start Monday." She ended the call and looked at the mountains for another moment, and then went back inside because there were still 2 hours left on her shift, and there were patients who needed things, and the job was the job, and she had never been the kind of person who waited for permission to do it. The formal investigation into Marcus Redd concluded 11 weeks later. He was terminated from Harlow Peak Medical Center on the 43rd day of his administrative suspension, the termination letter citing conduct unbecoming a department chief, violation of the hospital's staff protection policy across multiple documented incidents, and cooperation with an external entity in a manner that created conflicts of interest, inconsistent with his fiduciary duties to the institution. The state medical board opened a formal disciplinary proceeding the following week, a process that would take months and whose outcome was not certain, because these things were not certain, because institutions and licensing bodies moved at their own pace through their own channels, and the pace was often insufficient, and the channels were often narrow. But the proceeding was open. The record was made. The documentation was there. 30 months of it. The complaints that had been closed, and the staff who had left, and the pattern that a federal investigation had made undeniable. And the people who had filed those complaints and moved on were notified by the hospital's legal department that their accounts had been formally entered into the record of the disciplinary proceeding, and whatever that meant for each of them, it meant that what they had said had not stayed buried. 2 of the 3 nurses who had filed complaints in the previous year were contacted by the HR department about returning to the facility under new terms. One of them did not respond. One of them declined, which was her right and her decision, and Wren did not second-guess it, because some things broke trust in ways that a changed administration could not fully repair, and understanding that was part of understanding how institutions actually worked, rather than how they were supposed to work. The third one came back in the 8th week, on a different floor under a different supervisor, and Wren met her in the break room on her first day back and said, "Welcome back." And the woman said, "I heard about you." And Wren said, "Don't believe everything." And the woman laughed, the short, surprised laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh in that context, and that was all they said about it, which was enough. The federal case moved through channels at the pace federal cases moved through channels. The logistics coordinator pleaded guilty in the 9th week. The 2 individuals apprehended south of Delwick were charged and awaiting trial. The consulting entity through which Redd had received payment was dissolved, and its principals were under investigation, a process that the investigators told Wren, when she asked, would take a minimum of another 6 months. She filed the question away and stopped tracking the timeline, because tracking it served nothing, and the part of her that had been involved was documented and submitted, and she had done what she could do, and the rest was someone else's jurisdiction. Danny Holt was discharged from Harlow Peak on day 19. He walked out on his own legs, which his vascular surgeon had told him in week 2 was the better-than-expected outcome the repair had managed, though walked was generous for the first few days, and the physical therapy he had ahead of him was going to cover months. And he was clear-eyed about that in the way he'd been clear-eyed about most things in the conversations they'd managed to have in the weeks since his extubation. He was not uncomplicated. He had survivor's guilt about the flight crew, and he had a complicated relationship with his own body's limits that the rehab team was working through with him, and some days he was easier in it than others. He was 26 years old and had survived 2 significant traumatic injuries in 4 years, and was deciding what that meant about what came next, and he didn't know yet, and she thought the not knowing was honest, and she trusted him to move through it. Garrett Lowe had been cleared of any operational culpability for the in-flight emergency. The hydraulic failure was traced to a maintenance issue at the originating facility. Nothing intentional, nothing anyone had missed through negligence, just the specific category of mechanical failure that existed below the threshold of any reasonable inspection protocol. He had made the right call redirecting to Harlow Peak. He'd been told that in official language in the 5th week, and he'd received it with the flat acknowledgement of someone who had never needed the official language to know it was true. He came back to Delwick in week 8 for reasons connected to the federal case, and found Wren in the hospital cafeteria at lunch, and sat down across from her with a tray of food that he ate without apparent attention. The way field-trained people ate when eating was logistics rather than pleasure. "You stayed," he said. "I stayed," she said. He looked around the cafeteria, which was exactly what a regional hospital cafeteria looked like. Functional, slightly underfunded, full of people in various stages of a workday. "How is it?" She thought about the curriculum she was building, which was the most intellectually demanding thing she'd done in years, and was turning out to be more satisfying than she'd expected, because teaching was a different kind of keeping people alive, and she was discovering she had a facility for it that she hadn't known she possessed. She thought about the residents who came to her trauma sessions now and sat in the front and asked questions that showed they'd been thinking about the previous session, and about the nurses who had started coming too, unofficially, because word had moved through the floor the way word moved. She thought about Becca, who was going to be an excellent nurse in about 4 more years and already knew more than she thought she did. She thought about Yolanda, who had stopped by her office once to leave a printed journal article about field-expedient lytic delivery with a post-it note that said simply, "Thought you'd have opinions." And she had had opinions, and had written them in the margins, and had left the article on Yolanda's locker, and the exchange had continued for 3 weeks with no one having to name what it was. "It's good," she said. "Mostly." "Mostly," he said. "There's still a lot wrong with how this building runs," she said. "The red piece was one piece. The culture underneath it is older than he is." She shrugged, the honest shrug of someone who knew how big the problem was and had made a choice to be inside it anyway. "That takes longer. But you're going to work on it." "I'm going to work on what I can work on," she said, "within my scope, one protocol at a time." Lowe looked at her with the expression she'd seen from him before, the one that was calibrated and careful but had warmth somewhere inside the calibration, visible only if you were looking for it. "You know, Holt says you never changed," he said. "Same as you were in the field, apparently." "He's wrong," she said. "I changed a lot." "He means the part that matters didn't." She looked at her coffee. She thought about that, about what it meant to have a part of yourself that persisted through everything you'd chosen and everything that had chosen you, the part that showed up in a burning vehicle and showed up in a trauma bay and showed up in an OR at 2 a.m. and would, she supposed, show up in the curriculum she was building, in the sessions she was running, in the next person who came to her with a clinical problem that had no clean answer and needed someone who had been in rooms where the answers were never clean. She didn't know what to call that part. She wasn't sure it needed a name. "Tell him I said to work the PT," she said. "All of it, not just the parts he thinks he needs. He'll ignore that advice." "I know," she said. "Tell him anyway." She finished her coffee and went back to work, back through the corridors she knew now not just by their layout, but by their texture. The 3rd floor's specific late afternoon light, the sound the ER made on a Thursday afternoon versus a Saturday night. The break room where people said the things they couldn't say anywhere else, and the stairwell where she had stood at 3 in the morning and learned that the ordinary she'd chosen was not as separate from who she was as she'd believed. It wasn't what she'd planned. But she had been the one choosing all the way through, even on the night when the choices came faster than she could have anticipated, even in the moments that cost her more than she'd budgeted. She had been the one. And that was not a small thing. That was the thing, actually. The thing she had spent 17 years in service learning and 3 more years in quiet relearning. The lesson that came not from training or deployment or any single night of controlled chaos, but from the accumulated weight of all of it arriving at the same simple conclusion. What you do with your capability is the only account that finally matters. Not the title above it, not the institution around it, not the recognition attached to it or withheld from it. The choice you make when the window closes and the patient is dying and the person with authority tells you to stand down. That choice. That is the thing. That is where you find out what you actually are, underneath everything that has been layered over it by other people's definitions. Wren Carter had found out. She was the same thing she had always been, in the places nobody named and the hospital nobody thought twice about, in the field and in the OR and in the break room and in the curriculum she was building out of everything she'd carried for 17 years that had needed somewhere useful to go. She was someone who showed up. She was someone who knew how. She was someone who chose. That was more than enough.